Welcome back to Philosophy 1101, Problems of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut. We have now completed 3 units of this course, one on assessing arguments, one on philosophy of religion, and one on ethics. We're now moving into the 4th part of this course, epistemology, and today we'll be introducing some general questions in the area of philosophy, known as epistemology, also known as the theory of knowledge. Now, if you ask yourself, what is the source of if I think I've got any knowledge, what is the source of that? Where does it come from? The most natural answer that we nowadays tend to want to offer tends to be in the form of what's now known in philosophy as empiricism. That is, we think we know lots of things. How many of the things that we know turn out or might turn out to be dubious? Well, empiricism is the philosophical doctrine that says those bits of knowledge that you have that you can lay claim to, that you can find to be justifiable, that have not just a cause in your belief system, but actually can justify parts of your belief system, those things are based on empirical evidence that is from the experiential productions or products of your senses: vision, hearing, taste, smell, etc. And there might be some ways in which you put different sensory modalities together, like, for example, when you both hear and touch something, when you both see and smell something, but those are all legitimate sources of information about the world. That is to say, it's very natural for us to think that if somebody makes a claim, they state that something is the case, it's natural for us to think that, well, you could, in principle, always challenge them by asking, how do you know? And one would expect that, for the most part, their answers can be traced back, ultimately, even if it would be tedious in some cases, ultimately to some empirical evidence. For example, it might be you say something like, a crime was committed in Boston yesterday, and I say, well, how do you know that? And you respond by saying, well, I read it in the newspaper, and we might thereby settle the question, but we settle it only because we're assuming that the reporters and the news agency in general, the visual system that the reporters had when they were taking a look at the crime scene and so forth, those were all reliable sources of experiential information. On the assumption that all those things are in good working order, we can say, yes, there's reason to believe that the claim that there was a crime committed in Boston yesterday is a true claim. Now, empiricism might seem so obvious as to barely be worth mentioning, but in fact, it could be doubted. One might raise questions about it. So just as we, after first feeling like utilitarianism as an ethical theory seemed obvious as an answer to the question, what makes right acts right, we then found problems with it and some very controversial implications that it has, so too, you might wonder a little bit about empiricism after that first experience of feeling that it seems so obvious as to be barely worth stating. For instance, in general, you might ask, if I'm an empiricist, then I claim to know that all knowledge comes from and only from sensory experience. But then again, how do I know that that particular claim comes from sensory experience? What evidence that I might get from vision or with aids to visual experience, like, for example, a microscope or even a telescope, how could those help me to determine that empiricism is a true theory? That is to say, empiricism might be correct, but I'm not sure if I could state that it's correct in such a way as to be able to back it up with experiential evidence, with evidence of the senses. That's one general question one might have. More specifically, you might ask, what does an empiricist, that is someone who espouses empiricism, what would they say about things that we take ourselves to know, but that don't seem to be connected up in any obvious way with experience of the senses? For example, I take it you think that various mathematical claims are true, that 2 + 2 is 4, that there's no largest integer. But I'm doubtful that you have evidence of the senses, vision, touch, taste, smell, etc., that are going to convince you of that, or that could convince somebody of that if they're not already convinced, that would establish those claims. It doesn't seem like we know about the truths of mathematics in empirical terms. Likewise, think about ethics. When we have a view such as that torturing a person, an innocent person, and a person who has not committed any crime, is wrong, then we might feel very strongly about that, but it's not clear what experiments we might conduct that would help us settle that question. That is to say, many philosophers have worried that if empiricism is true, it might make a mystery of what we take to be our knowledge of facts, both of mathematics and of ethics, perhaps other areas as well. So as you think about empiricism, I want you to ask yourself, of the vast number of things that you take yourself to know, which of those things are ones that you can trace back to sensory justification, where you can trace back the chain of justifications to the point where you can say, there is the empirical test, there is the event happening before my eyes that justifies the claim. It's not clear what you would do in the case of ethics or in the case of mathematics. Now, our next major philosopher whose work we'll be looking at, Plato, is going to try to show, in fact, that empiricism is questionable, and he does so by means of a dialogue between his teacher Socrates and a man named Meno. First, a little bit about Socrates, as represented in this dialogue known as Meno. Here's an image of him. He was known as a not particularly handsome man. His dates were 469 BC to 399 BC. He was the son of a midwife and a sculptor. He never published a word, even though he's one of the most famous philosophers in the Western tradition. He spent most of his time hanging around in the Lyceum, a kind of public place in ancient Athens where people would trade and gossip and share information with each other of various kinds. And he would often engage people in conversations about things that he cared about, for example, virtue and justice, knowledge, etc. And he spent more of his time questioning other people, trying to assess their own justifications for their beliefs than he did trying to espouse his own theories. He would often serve as kind of like a gadfly on other people in the Lyceum by bugging them with regard to questions, how do they know the things that they believe to be true? And he would sometimes embarrass his interlocutors by showing that they knew less than they took themselves to know. Socrates' student, Plato, who is the author of the dialogue known as the Meno, his dates were 428 to 347 BC. And he, like a handful of other young Athenian men who were generally speaking fairly wealthy, fairly aristocratic, Plato wrote down much of what he heard Socrates say, both what came out of Socrates' mouth as well as the things that his interlocutors would say. And when he was young, Plato wrote dialogues that would more or less be fairly accurate reports, historically accurate reports of the conversations that he witnessed between Socrates and other people. As he became older, he would often use the dialogue form as a kind of rhetorical device, as a kind of literary device in which he would formulate his own ideas. And as time went on, Socrates and his interlocutors would become more like characters in a drama where Plato felt less obliged to represent anything the actual historical Socrates had to say. He used this more as a tool to develop his own ideas. Nothing particularly bad about that, but just keep in mind that not all things that you read from Plato that purport to represent Socrates speaking are necessarily historically accurate. Plato also founded what is thought of as Europe's first university, this institution called the Academy, that went from 387 BC and was eventually closed in 529 AD. And Plato very famously espoused a lot of theories, a lot of profound and subtle and magnificently complicated but interesting theories about the nature of the universe, about what is now known as metaphysics and the place of humanity in the universe, as well as many theories about politics, the proper organization of a society, and so on. So that's the relationship and broad outline between Socrates and his student, Plato.